Good afternoon, everybody. Right. Good afternoon. My name is John Humphrey. I'm the Director of the Business and Development Centre at the Institute of Development Studies. And first of all, I'd like to welcome you all here to this launch meeting. And IDS is very pleased that you could take the time to come today. We think we have an interesting and exciting agenda about business and development and how we can take forward research and collaborations in this area. We've got a very good list of speakers reflecting the diversity of types of businesses, locations, different types of from developing countries and from developed countries, and we're looking forward to an interesting discussion that will raise new issues and define areas of priority for our future research. I have a couple of housekeeping items that I have to draw your attention to before we start. First of all, if there is a fire alarm, it means that there might be a fire. It's not a test. The tests take place early in the morning. So if the fire alarm goes off, it's a continuous noise, then please vacate the building, and the assembly point is the Duke of York Steps, which is out at the front of the building to the right. No smoking is allowed in the building, obviously, at any time. And if you need first aid or if there's any health issue, then please contact one of the organisers at the back of the room and we'll provide assistance for you. Okay, we're running a little bit late, so I don't want to delay any further in introducing this session. And so I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Jodie Thorpe from IDS, who's going to chair the first session. Thank you.
Just checking. Yes, it's on. Hi. I'm Jodie Thorpe. As John said, I'm a research fellow at IDS in the Business and Development Centre, and I'm going to be moderating our first session today, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to introduce and welcome Shankar Venkateshwaran, who is the Chief of the Sustainability Group for the Tata Group, and we're really pleased at the Centre that he's been willing to come out and make the keynote presentation today. I won't try to repeat his CV, but he's got a very long and varied experience in the area of business and development. I mean, starting right from having an MBA with the Indian Institute of Management through to being part of founding and running an organization called Partners in Change in India, which was set up in 1995, and I think, very early on, and a real pioneer in thinking about how business becomes a partner in development. He's on the board of ActionAid Ghana. He has recently been the Director of Sustainability and Climate Change at PricewaterhouseCoopers in India, and is now leading, as I said, the Sustainability Group at Tata. And he's going to reflect for us on where next for business and development, drawing on his experience and that of the Tata Group, which itself is sort of a fascinating global and yet also very Indian, I think, company that has been doing a lot in this area. Shankar.
Thank you, Jodie. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I got this invitation. I was actually terrified because IDS is a place that one sort of holds in awe in terms of what it does in development studies. So my first instinct was to say, no, I can't do this. But then I said, maybe they're not going to call me again, so I might as well come. So here I am. And I'm actually delighted, and I'm very thankful to IDS for inviting me here. What I'm going to try and do in the next 20-25 minutes, maybe half an hour. The trouble with time, as I was just telling Jodie a little while ago, is in India we look at time as a very philosophical construct. So we sometimes go a little here and there about it. But Jodie, my request to you is if I wander, just pull me back and I'll try and make sure we keep time. So the topic is where next for business and development. And the way I've tried to structure it is in these couple of sections. I'll start with the Tata Group and its legacy. I think it's important because that informs a lot of the ways we think and we go forward. And it's a very, very old group, and it's interesting that that legacy still holds and it's vibrant. I will then take you through some of the development challenges as I see it, not so much from a development perspective, which I'm sure all of you in the room are familiar with, but just to try and focus more on the challenges side of it, especially where it intersects with business and what business can play and where business can play a role. I'll also reflect on some of the new thinking and the new actors that are in the space. So there are old actors with new thinking, there are some new actors that are coming in, and all of them are actually impacting the way development will play out and therefore the role of business going forward. So I'll reflect a bit on that. I'll also talk about how business is responding. I will, of course, draw from some of our experiences in the group, but it's not going to be restricted to that. I would try and make it more generic than that. And I'll just end with a couple of thoughts that I thought as the center moves forward, it could consider thinking about in terms of just framing the agenda. So that's basically how I'm going to do it. And I'm going to go through the sections, the earlier sections a little quickly in the interest of time. So I'll start with the Tata Group and its legacy. So we are pretty large, and the numbers are there. I'm not going to repeat them. We're going to be large in terms of numbers, in terms of turnover. What is interesting is that almost over 60% of our revenue is generated overseas. So we are, though an Indian company and an Indian group, but most of our revenue is actually generated globally. And therefore, a global perspective is something that we definitely have and we try and bring to the table. What is not there on this slide is the ownership pattern. A lot of the companies, I think perhaps around 60% of the companies are actually owned by trusts. And that puts a very different sort of way in which the company looks at business and what it does with its profits. But this just a bit of statistics for you. We have a large presence in India, in the UK, and these are some of the companies that are significant players in the UK. We are the largest foreign investor in the UK and perhaps the largest employer in the UK. So we have a significant presence, and UK is an important place for us. And that reflects also in the way we work with communities in the UK. And there's a lot of stuff that we do around skills, and there are some numbers that tell you how intensive this work is. We work with NACUE, a lot of interesting work on entrepreneurship, and we are part of the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. But what this prize also does is to encourage more and more young people to go into the engineering and technical spaces, and that's part of what we do. And there are many others, but just to give you a sense of how important the UK is for us and how important communities and working with communities, which is a very core part of our thinking, is embedded even in the UK. In many ways, as a group, we've been ahead of our time. And I'm saying this because I think it does inform the culture of what we do. And these are just some timelines for you. Way back in 1901, we started with pension and gratuity and provident funds, which were in place, almost unheard of. In 1912, we had already introduced an 8-hour working day. All this well before the legal systems came to place. In fact, one of the things a lot of Indian companies worry about is when we do something, they feel that it will soon become law. And so they kind of almost discourage us from doing it. But that's just, I'm being a little facetious here, but we take this very seriously. And so what we do is something that really comes from a strong belief. And what is that belief? And why is that belief? What is that driver? It's actually a founder, Jamshedji Tata. We celebrated his 175th birthday this year, 3rd of March. But what makes it significant is what he said way back. And this is what he said. He said, in a free enterprise, the community is not just another stakeholder, but it is in fact the very purpose for its existence. So that's how core this is to us. So for us, being in development and being in business are not necessarily two different things. The belief very much is if you're going to be in business, you've got to be in development. Otherwise, there is no business. So that's just by way of a background as to why this is so core to our being. Now let me quickly go down to some of the development challenges as we see them from our standpoint. And of course, the first thing I wanted to do is to put a framework around it, because development means different things to different people. So I've just tried to put it into words the way we try to understand and look at it. Not just a Tata, this is not just the Tata way, but this is generally the way a lot of us tend to look at development. So it's about focusing on increasing an individual's access to and control over resources. We are familiar with that notion. And the resources may be physical, financial, political, whatever be the resources that are required to live a life with dignity. So if we call this the process of development, then what does it mean when you say, when you're looking or moving on this journey of development? Clearly, what are the resources that are critical, and when they get denied, are the ones that cause underdevelopment. And these could be around land and water on the one hand, it could be access to finance and markets on the other, various kinds of health and education services, and of course rights and entitlements. So within the framework of development, in a sense, what we are saying is that these need to get addressed. And the fact that if you're going down the development path, are these getting addressed? How are they getting addressed, and what is the role of business is really what I'm going to talk about in the rest of this talk today. Now, what are the challenges? Let me start with the whole notion of inequity and exclusion. This, to us, is a very, very crucial challenge. It's not unfamiliar to any of you. You all know it. But it's just something that strikes us very, very strongly in the way we look at development in the group, as well as most development actors that I know of. It's the inequity around gender, inequity around identity, which is getting even more complex, and issues of disability. And there are many more. I'm just naming three. But the whole point is the whole question of exclusion, the whole question of inequity is the core challenge, as I see, in any of those development processes to go forward. The other is the withdrawal of the state, and we see this happening a lot in the developing world. What happens, it's really unfortunate, but what is happening is that as the state realizes that it's not able to provide those services that it is meant to do, it is constitutionally in some cases mandated to do, whether it's education or whether it's agricultural extension just to name two extremes, it's realizing that it's unable to do this, and the response sadly is of withdrawal, almost abdication, and this causes a lot of anxiety and a lot of agitation in most of these developing countries that we see, both in Africa and definitely in India. And what the state seems to want to do is to then get markets, private sector, and private players to start filling in these gaps. And very often, some of these are just not suitable for market interventions. So that causes that whole gap in terms of just access to these services, as well as being able to use these services even when you can actually access them in the first place. So this is the other big challenge. Labor rights. This is again a very, very disturbing phenomenon that we are noticing. Outsourcing is certainly one cause. Outsourcing, and we're not talking necessarily about outsourcing jobs from the UK to India or US to the Philippines, but even within the countries, the kind of outsourcing that happens. And the resulting very often in a process of informalization. In fact, just to throw a number at you, a couple of years ago there was a study done of the informal sector in India, and it was found that of the 500 million people who are in the working age, not more than 7% were actually in the organized sector. So you had 93% people living in the working as unorganized sector workers. And what is happening is that the nature, and business will give you its argument, the development players will give you another argument as to why this is happening. But this is the reality. But what this is also doing is that the process of collective bargaining and the process of trade unionization, which sort of worked on the assumption that you would find a whole lot of workers in one single physical space, since that is no longer there, the whole question of how workers' rights get actually negotiated in a manner which makes sense both to the workers and to business is actually under threat. And that vacuum is getting created, and this vacuum is being filled by a whole set of different actors. And I'll come to those actors, because some of those actors are not necessarily easy ones to negotiate with. But this whole labor issue is sort of unhelpful both from a development perspective and from a business perspective, and that's, I think, a cause of great concern. Then, of course, the question of corruption. And especially for me, as an Indian, this is something that is very crucial, because we've been having this whole issue around corruption and fighting corruption in the streets politically in the last year and a half, and we're going to elections next month. And corruption is and will be a big issue. It never was as big an issue as it has been this time. And I think what is happening is that it's not just corruption in armament deals, which used to be what used to be there in the past, but it's corruption at the grassroots level. And for the poor to be able to access services of poor quality and then have to pay or bribe for what is their right is a huge development issue for us. And that is therefore a big question. And of course, unfortunately, this whole notion of crony capitalism, which you hear about in many countries in Africa, in parts of Asia, it's a word that's suddenly become very common in India. And there's been a lot of this going around. The sad thing about it for a group like ours is that we get hit with the same, when the mud gets flung, some of it falls on us. And that is, I think, a problem for a lot of organized sector, serious players who are trying to address this issue. So corruption affects not only the poor, it also affects business, and it affects this whole notion of how business can play in development in a manner that is seen to be progressive rather than trying to get something for themselves. Let me now quickly get on to something on the new actors and the new thinking. NGOs and activists are not new actors, but they are actually filling in very interesting spaces. They're filling in the spaces that the state has retreated from. A lot of services are increasingly being run by NGOs. Communities are asking NGOs to run them. States are asking NGOs to run them. And that's part of the whole withdrawal point that I was making earlier. What is also happening, interestingly, is because of the trade unions not being able to work their whole process because of the decentralized nature of manufacture and the service sector, which is predominant in a lot of the developing world. That whole notion of labor rights is now falling more and more on NGOs to actually pick up, and NGOs are getting in there. And this is not necessarily what they understand very well, but they just feel forced into getting in there. But of course, what does happen is, I mentioned the informalization, and that's a space that NGOs understand better and occupy. But again, the whole rules of the game are still being worked out as to how you negotiate with somebody who represents an informal sector group or represents a formal sector, but where the workers do not get represented by the formal trade unions. But of course, the good news we know is that NGOs are better networked, better resourced, and certainly far more savvy in using media, both social media and the mainstream media. But what is happening is that there is a rapid reinvention of the roles of NGOs that is happening in a lot of the developing world. And that's very interesting to see how that will pan out going forward. Communities themselves, this we know. We in the group have been at the receiving end of it. Many companies have. But what is very clear is that the whole notion of a license to operate is no longer like time a theoretical construct. It is actually here to stay, and there is a lot of pushes that are happening on this, and there is and mind you, this is again something that the state is meant to do, is meant to help people who are getting, say, displaced because of a project or whatever, but the state doesn't necessarily do it. And so communities are recognizing that they need to just do it themselves. And so how that plays out, and how that plays out with NGOs and activists in the fray, is something that again is an unknown going forward. Militant groups, this is a really worrisome piece. You will find this, I mean, you normally associate, I mean, not normally, but you know that this happens in a lot of Africa. We've talked about conflict minerals, we know what happens in all those places, but it's also happening, it happened in Nepal, it's a huge problem in India, because what is happening is that underdevelopment and the kind of statelessness that exists in some geographies are then filled by these actors. Okay, and they start with with a development agenda, but they believe that you can't do it through peaceful means. Gandhian ways are no longer the way it's going to work. And so militancy starts creeping in, and it almost becomes endless, because, and we saw what happened in Sri Lanka, for example, it becomes endless, it becomes an end in itself rather than the means to get social justice. And moment that starts happening, then again, either whether you're a traditional development player or you're a state or you're a business, you just don't know how to deal with this animal, because it's an animal that has been created by all of us jointly, but we don't know what to do with it. And this is therefore a very, very serious question. Political parties are reinventing themselves, and this has been interesting. And you'll find this, and we've seen this in a lot of countries as election approaches, that you suddenly see people's issues are ways to win elections. Never mind what you do after the election, but you certainly use it as a means to win elections. And what seems to also become, and that's the real interesting and somewhat scary part, is being anti-business seems to be a way by which a lot of political parties believe they can get mileage. So an anti-business stance is increasingly becoming quite common, and one hardly knows whether it is a political gimmick or it's something more serious. But what happens is that when political parties take a stance, and a lot of them do it, and when they come into power, we don't know how they're going to behave. So from a business point of view, this is a real big unknown. And it's a real big unknown also if you're serious about being a business that wants to work in development, because you don't know how this factor is going to play out for you. Finally, a quick word on judiciary. This we've seen again in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh. I don't think we see it much in Africa, but the judiciary is also now filling the vacuum of the state's withdrawal. And judicial activism is becoming very, very interesting. A lot of things in India, and I can talk more about India because I know more about it. So for example, the whole environmental laws in India are actually something that was driven by the Supreme Court of India around a constitutional fundamental right of the right to life. So they interpreted right to life and pushed that down into a way when we ended up legislating an Environment Protection Act and moving that down. So the judiciary is, again, this is not their traditional role, but they are getting into this, and their role in making the development process better for the poor is actually quite significant. But of course, the problem with the judiciary, unlike the legislature, is where the legislature at least goes to the elections and gets a mandate. The judiciary is appointed. So if you get a rogue there, God knows what will happen. But there it is. It's the animal out there, and we got to take it seriously. So what is the response? And I will try and take you through this very quickly. But what is the response? And what will drive this response? Now, traditional thinking, in fact, a lot of the thinking and a lot of the literature you see is around the stakeholder-led way of pushing business into development. So it's external stakeholders, investors, regulations, and so on. The external drivers that push business to behave more responsibly, for business to look at sustainability more seriously, and for business to start playing a bigger role in the whole development game. That's certainly one viewpoint. But another viewpoint which doesn't get talked about, and I think probably under-researched, is what I call the internal drivers. And for us in the group, in the Tata Group, it is this actually that drives us. It's the internal drivers that drive us. It's less the external drivers than the internal drivers. And I would argue, therefore, that it's a very significant part of what will make companies participate in the process of development. And then you have a whole bunch of them that have to make this leap of faith. Because if you have the business case, which is the external driver one, you're okay. If you have the internal one, you don't care about the business case. But you have the ones that are in between. And a lot of them actually are making this leap of faith. In fact, it was interesting that even if you look at Puma's EPNL, and I asked Joachim in Rio, I said, what made you do this? And he said, leap of faith. So it's interesting that what leap of faith can do at the end of the day in this agenda. So leap of faith is the unknown factor in all this. So what are businesses doing? Certainly in skills. I already talked about what we as a group do in the UK in the skills, but skills is certainly an opportunity for business to play a role in development because of the fact that they understand this, they understand jobs, they understand it better than the state, they understand it better than NGOs. So actually, who better than business to get involved in this whole process? There are challenges, of course, because why should business do this? Should it be philanthropic? Is there a business case for it? Is there some sort of a business return on it? There is a lot of government funds sloshing around, definitely in India, but it's very difficult for groups that want to be ethical to sort of address and try and get those funds from government sources because they come with strings attached and you don't necessarily like those strings. So there are challenges, but this is clearly a space where a business can play a role. We are definitely going to be in that space. We've set ourselves a target in India that by 2022, every year we will skill 1 million young people. Whatever work we're doing in Europe and Africa, and we do a lot of this, I mentioned what we do in the UK to you, that will continue because this is a space for us where we really think we can play and make a difference. In the supply chain, and I'm sure we're going to hear more about it this afternoon, work around SMEs, formalizing the informal sector. This is a big challenge because what happens is the tier 2 and tier 3 and tier 4 suppliers is where a lot of the informalization starts happening, not necessarily in the tier 1 supplier. And so there is work to be done there, and many of the companies in the group are doing that. But what this also enables you to do is to push these practices down the supply chain and also driving affirmative action programs. In fact, Tata Motors in India actually has an affirmative action program where they work with certain left out caste groups who are trying to become entrepreneurs and actually help them get into the supply chain of Tata Motors. So it is driven by a business motive of saying we need a supply chain, but we are also at the same time trying to push in an agenda of affirmative action into that. There are challenges, of course, because in the short term, it sometimes doesn't make business sense. And this is a struggle that Tata Motors, as we speak, is facing because in India it's not doing well. JLR is doing well, but the Indian part of Tata Motors isn't. So what do you do when in the short term it's more expensive because it means investing in your supply chain? And what happens if your competitors are not doing that? So there are challenges of playing in this role, but this is clearly a role where business has to and can, and many of them do play a role. Water, certainly something that businesses are doing both within the fence as well as outside, looking at technologies, innovating distribution models. Challenges, of course, because since water is not usually priced properly in most places, the incentive to do this is less. So this is where the external driver is less important and the internal driver actually pushes this agenda. Of course, then when you're talking about technologies, it's the consumer's ability to pay, and a lot of the question, the core question in development is, can you charge for water? It's a gift of nature. Can you charge for air that you breathe? Can you charge for water that you drink, and so on and so forth? These are other kinds of ethical questions in the development space. And this is again an area that we as a group are certainly interested in investing in. Affirmative action, talking about exclusion as a key challenge, and a lot of companies can do this, and a lot of companies are trying to do this in different ways, whether it's with women, whether it's with certain caste groups, looking at disability, and weaving this across not just in their own employment, but in the supply chain as well as in community interventions. And of course, there are huge challenges with who's an excluded group, and politics of identity can be very, very messy. In India, it's a terrible, terrible mess. And for companies that don't understand this, it becomes very difficult to get into it. We have a very strong affirmative action program. And we actually have a competition where we ask the companies to compete, and we actually award companies that actually do well in terms of affirmative action. So that's the way we deal with this. So I'll leave you with some final thoughts, which is not necessarily trying to sum up what I'm saying, but just for me what the takeaways when I was putting this together were. One, I think, is that understanding the company drivers is key. The drivers in a sector, in a context, in a country, all those are important. But one also has to understand what drives a particular company into getting into development or playing a role in development. And that driver is very, very important to understand. I would argue, purely based on our experience and a lot of other companies that I know of, that internal drivers actually are stronger. And companies that do this because of an internal set of drivers are the ones that will stay with this. And I think that's, to me, an important question for researchers to sort of look at. A third thought is this whole question of business case vis-a-vis a business connect. Now, a business case could be built around a regulation, but a business connect is it in some way actually connected with your business, so that even during bad times you would still do this. So, for example, and this is trying to move away from the traditional notion of corporate philanthropy versus trying to work in development in a manner that works with your business. So working in agriculture, if you are a food company, makes more sense than for TCS to necessarily work, Tata Consultancy Services, which is an IT software company, to work in agriculture. So the business connect starts playing a role. And finally, I think it's important because companies are getting hit from many, many places, communities, the state, political parties, everyone is sort of getting after companies, and I'm sure they have good reasons to do that. It's also important for researchers to celebrate some of the things that good companies are doing. And I think it just helps, because if the company says it, it's PR. If somebody else says it, then it's actually taken very seriously. I leave it there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Shankar, thank you very much for that. That was a really, I think, helpful overview of some of the challenges, but also thoughts on both the ways forward for business, but I think also quite helpfully for us, some of the thoughts on where the research agenda needs to go around some of this. So that was great. We have time for questions and comments now. Given we're a little bit off time, I'm not sure exactly how much, but certainly I'd hope 10 minutes at least we could take. So I will open the floor. I'll take 3 questions at a time, or 3 comments, but please do keep them brief and to the point, so that we can hopefully get a fair amount in. And there's some roving mics around to help us. So there's one question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Bruce Byers from ECDPM, the European Centre for Development Policy Management. Thank you for this interesting talk which you just gave. I think I agree with your key sort of final remark that we need to understand what's driving these companies. But what I also took right from the beginning was there's a lot about culture, and I mean, you said yourself, internal drivers are a big issue. So if that's the case, then it's kind of, I mean, can we only say that it's a leap of faith then in terms of those other companies that don't start off with that sort of internal drive? And perhaps related to that, you also talked about the state stepping back. So how does that then fit in? So those companies with a good sort of internal view of how they fit with society, do they then see the state stepping back as a kind of opportunity, or is it kind of a push that they're kind of obliged to go into some of these things? Thank you.
My name is Joyce Kortland from Oxfam International. Thanks very much for an interesting presentation. You started by sketching the history of Tata with a long social history. And you explained also that Tata is now moving more into supply chain issues. So I think you're moving from, if I understand you well, you're moving from a more philanthropic approach to a supply chain approach. In your background, part of your background has also been NGO background. You've been part of, you have helped setting up Partners in Change. You're on the board of, have been on the board of Action Aid, and you sketched in your final remarks also that you think that internal drivers are more important than external drivers. But from your NGO background, or that part of your history, I'd like to ask you what interventions of NGOs are most helpful in order to help drive companies like Tata and others from a more philanthropic approach, a more charity approach, to a more supply chain approach.
Right. Back.
Hi, thanks. This is Jonathan from the Scaling Up Nutrition movement. Thanks very much for that presentation. I'd be really interested to know now that business is seen as a crucial actor on many sustainability issues, what do you need as a business in terms of that external alignment? Because many different organizations, global partnerships will be coming to you, and I have a feeling often we're duplicating each other's work. So what do you need, and what is your advice for what we need to do to better align big global partnerships to make it easier for companies to play their role across many environmental and development issues? Thanks.
Great. Thanks for those really good questions. Shankar, I'll turn over to you.
I'll try and address them in the same sequence. Yeah, so the question, I think the point that I made about internal versus external, or vis-a-vis external, what I was trying to say was that when it gets embedded, so when it becomes embedded and becomes part of the DNA, which is part of being an internal driver, that's when it sort of stays independent of what happens in the marketplace. Now, the question is, and that's where the leap of faith comes. The question is that even if the trigger may be an external driver, it may be a regulation, it may be a consumer action, it may be whatever external drivers push you in there. The challenge for the company is how to embed that and then make that the part of the culture of the DNA. We were fortunate because our founder had a different vision. Our founder's vision itself embedded these things, and so we had a slightly different, we had an advantage, so to speak. But but for companies that are not necessarily built the same way, it's a matter of how it gets embedded. And I have to say that I don't think it's very unique to us as a group. My own hypothesis is that the Anglo-Saxon model of corporations is very different from the European and perhaps the Asian model of corporations. And I think that even European, as opposed to UK and the US, has more of this internal driver way of looking at of responsibility, rather than the Anglo-Saxon model, which seems to be more joint stock company sort of embedded. So that's my sort of take on this. So leap of faith is important because the leap of faith then pushes it into becoming a part of the internal drivers, a part of becoming the DNA. On the question that you asked on philanthropy vis-a-vis supply chain, I'm not sure whether we would call that philanthropy. When I was drawing up the history of what the group was doing in the early 20th century, it was actually doing a lot of work. It was working with workers and labor rights well before they became part of law. So it wasn't done from a philanthropic perspective. It was done from, you could almost say that there was a business case. But the business case was a leap of faith there, because nobody actually sat and did the calculations and said, if I do this, this is my return and this is my investment, so my return on investment is great. Leap of faith is also about that. It's about just feeling intuitively that this is the right thing to do. So I won't sort of put it as philanthropy versus supply chain versus anything else. That's just an intuitive understanding that this is important for your business in the long run. When one looks at it from that point of view, your question was on what can NGOs do. Well, I think what definitely I think the way NGOs should look at it, and that's certainly how I used to look at it when I used to be with an NGO and trying to work with companies, is the point that I made in my last slide in the business connect part of it. And I think that a lot of NGOs, when they go and talk to companies, almost ask companies to do this as something that they have to do. They don't necessarily talk about it from what is the benefits to the company in trying to do this. So it's almost a how shall I say? It's not a discussion. It's about saying, we think this is the right thing to do, so will you do this? And all I'm saying, what has worked for me when I was, for example, in Partners in Change, is we used to work, a lot of our pitches were around saying, this is the benefit to communities, this is the benefit to you as a company, this is the business connect, and this is why one should do it, so how about taking this further? So that's the way we used to framework that discussion. So I don't know whether that is helpful. The last question, I'm afraid you'll have to sort of reword it, because I'm not quite sure I got it, because you talked about aligning global partnerships, but can you just rephrase that in a manner that I can try and respond to that?
Sure, happy to. So it's about what do you need as a business when multiple external actors are coming to you with many different ways that you could be, building your sustainability strategy. There are an increasing number of global partnerships that see a private sector dimension as key to unlocking progress on the MDGs or future kind of environmental goals. And it just strikes me that from a business perspective, it's very hard to work out who you should be working with, what the best partnership is. What do you need in terms of academic institutions, NGOs and global partnerships how do you need us to better align to help you work out what your effective input can be across these different areas?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, you're right. It is very confusing. And I'm actually sitting on that confusion as we speak, because I'm exactly in the same position. So I don't have a solution to it, but what I certainly know is that we have a reasonably good vision of where we want to be as a group. So our discussions with these bodies, whether they be company-led bodies or whether they be development-led bodies, whether they be research institutions or anything else, is trying to see whether there's an alignment in terms of their thinking with where we want to be as a business in terms of our sustainability agenda. So that's one key criteria. Is there an alignment? Second question is that we would like to look at is, are we getting challenged by them? Challenged in a constructive way. We get challenged every minute that we are awake, but not necessarily in a constructive way. So I'm talking about the more constructive kind of challenges in terms of helping us think through the agenda as it's going to unfold going forward. And that's really what strategy is, isn't it? It's about trying to get some sense of a prediction of the future. So where our own thinking as an incumbent, and that's the problem with incumbency, if that gets challenged in a constructive way, we would certainly like to work with those organizations. So that's something around the criteria that we use, or we are planning to use to do that. But at the end of the day, what I think we would end up doing is to be part of more global partnerships than less. To start with, and then see which ones are not working out and then move out of that rather than the other way around.
Great, thanks. We'll take one more round of questions, and I'll again sort of emphasize both to the questions and to Shankar, we'll need to be brief on dealing with these. So there's one over there on the right.
Hi, I'm Lisbeth Navas-Aleman. I'm a business and development consultant. My question, you will forgive me, my question comes from a lens of the role of multinationals from the South and also companies from the South, from the BRICS, that are becoming more and more international and perhaps having a stronger role in other developing countries beyond their own domestic markets. I'm trying to understand what kind of internal drivers they could have in order to have a contribution towards alleviating poverty in another country that is not their own. So I'm appealing, of course, to your experience with Indian companies in this case, perhaps companies that are much smaller than Tata, but that are nevertheless operating in Africa, for instance, or in another low-income country. What perhaps can you share with us about their internal drivers for contributing to alleviating global poverty in another domestic market that is not their own?
Great. There's a question up front here.
Thanks. This is Alex McGilvery from CDC Group. So, Shankar, the question I wanted to ask you was, the base of the pyramid was basically an Indian invention, I think, or maybe Chicago Business School, but has the patent. But it was C.K. Prahalad. But my impression is that there's not so much discussion going on in India these days about base of the pyramid. Do you have any observations about that? And is it just that we've missed the latest round of thinking on it?
Okay. Got over there. There's one last one.
Hello, my name's Pins Brown. I work for a very small labour rights consultancy called Ergon. I was very pleased, therefore, to see labour rights get lots of prominence in your presentation. And my question relates partly to the question that was just made. I've managed at least research in the tea industry, including in India, including related to the information that came out last week about Tetley, which obviously is owned by Tata. And I think the question of constructive challenge that I find interesting, I'm just curious to know your comments on, is a view that was put back to us about our research in India, which was done for Oxfam 2 years ago on wages in the tea industry, which was what was being picked up last week, was that more and more tea is being sold to China. And I'm presuming this is representative of other Tata products, and that Chinese buyers of tea just are not interested in any of these issues. So I'm curious to know how that plays out in Tata Group, that you may be receiving constructive challenge, I hope, from the likes of us and others, but what happens when other markets are not interested in challenge at all, let alone constructive? Thanks.
Great, thanks. Shankar.
Okay, I'm tempted to answer the last one first, and also the one on what Indian MNCs working in, say, Africa do. And I'll take an example. One of our companies, a chemical company, which makes soda ash and has a plant in Kenya, in a particular lake which is technically easier to make soda ash from. That lake extends into Tanzania, and the Tanzanian government were actually giving out leases to companies, and so this company was interested, went and did some recce over there. It was also a breeding ground for the lesser flamingo. And IUCN was in the pot. We brought them in, had long discussions, did some research, and we finally decided we are not going to set up a plant there because it is not the Tata way of doing things. So we didn't set up a plant there. But there is a postscript to that. a Chinese company is setting up a plant there. And IUCN is very concerned. And IUCN, I'm told, actually asked the Tanzanian government that if you want to actually give it out to a company to do this, then give it to Tata Chemicals, not to this company. So that's, I think, the Tata way of doing things, that it is something of concern to us. So if it is inherently, and that's why the internal drivers start becoming very important. So if you're an external driver driven company and that's what drives your sustainability, then it would depend on the context where you are. Whereas if you're driven internally, which is what we as a group are, then those values matter to us much more. So we would withdraw from Tanzania if it meant the lesser flamingo breeding ground gets damaged. It's as simple as that. So that would be the case with tea also. And the more recent discussion we can have on offline, but it's certainly it's certainly something that concerns us. But what is also interesting for companies like ours, and I'm not saying we are unique, but many companies like ours, is that by performing well in some of these parameters, you also set yourself up as a target. And I've heard any number of people and NGOs telling me this. Oh, that company, we expected them to behave like that, but not you guys. So the standards are very different. And that is also the story of the tea thing that you were talking about, and we'll talk about that some other time. So as far as, that's where the internal drivers come back again to being a very important way by which whichever company you are, and as I said, I don't think Tata's is unique in India. There are many other groups that have this internal value, board-driven, tradition-driven way of looking at sustainability, and they behave that way wherever they go. And that's another reason why it becomes important. On the question of the base of the pyramid, there is a lot of work happening. And I don't think Indian companies are necessarily very good at talking about this. But for example, we have Tata Chemicals, the same company that I was referring to, has a water purifier, which is a very, very low-cost water purifier. It doesn't use electricity and produces potable water, and it can cost as low as 800 rupees for a unit. So there are plenty of such examples, both within the group and outside. So it is alive and well. That's why I also made the point of having to celebrate and socialize these kinds of things. Because if we do it, then it's a PR exercise. If somebody else, if IDS does it, then it has to be serious, right? So maybe therein hangs the tail somewhere.
Right, I think on that note, it's a right moment to draw this session to a close. Thank you again, Shankar, for your presentation, for coming to be with us.